perspective, and Bob Woodward has had his perspective that was informed by his sources. And my perspective was of a president who was earnestly trying to work through these issues in a responsible way. And, the notion that we were sitting there with a political a barometer and making decisions on that basis was just wrong. He took his responsibilities as commander-in-chief very seriously.
Yeah, just for some context on that, in Obama's Wars by Bob Woodward, Jim Jones, who was the former National Security Advisor, prior to that he was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, he privately called you and Emmanuel and Robert Gibbs the, quote, water bugs, the Politburo, the mafia, who did not understand war or foreign relations and were too interested in measuring the domestic and electoral impact of the president's decisions in these areas.
Yeah. I didn't get to work with Jim that long because he didn't last as National Security Advisor that long. But I'm sure he meant that in the nicest way. Look, the reality is that presidents, everybody has their responsibilities. I never doubted for 1 second that the people who that our military leadership, our civilian leadership of the Pentagon, that everyone we dealt with was earnestly trying to fulfill their obligations, and they all had roles to play. The president's role is the broadest role. Part of that role is he's the one who actually has to sell these policies to the American people, sell these policies to the Congress. And, it may be irksome to other people in the process that we have these challenges in a democracy, but the president has to take them into account. How long did it take Franklin Roosevelt to move the country? And it was obviously the Japanese at Pearl Harbor that made the difference, but to move the country to wartime footing when there was an isolationist mood afoot in the country. John F. Kennedy, this is a slightly different point, but we have civilian leadership for a reason. If you go back to the wartime councils that he had, or the defense councils he had during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Curtis LeMay, who was the Air Force commander, wanted to bomb the hell out of Cuba. I think he may have said he wanted to nuke Cuba. Kennedy resisted that. And there was great skepticism about the embargo and whether that would work. But it was his responsibility to exercise that judgment and weigh all these factors. So that's a slightly different point. My point is that the president has a broader responsibility than anyone in the government, and everyone in the government fights from their perspective, as they should. His job is to synthesize all of this and make what he thinks is the best decision for the country, and part of that is, what the American people think and feel about these issues.
So you mentioned the importance of civilian leadership, and at the same time you have civilians working in the White House with the president, and then they correspond and work with the Pentagon as well. Can you talk about your experience working with military officials, kind of what their strengths and weaknesses are, what separates them from civilian counterparts?
Yes. It was interesting to me in reading Bob Gates's memoir, or one of his memoirs, where he was talking about, he worked in the White House on the NSC. He had a couple of stints, one under President Carter, one under President Bush. And he wrote about his frustration about the agencies. And he said every once in a while it'd be nice if they took into consideration what the president wanted to do. That was his perspective as a White House aide. As a defense secretary, I think that he wanted a little less guidance sometimes, particularly from White House staff. And that is a tension that I think exists in every administration. My perception of the military was, as I said earlier, I had absolutely no doubt about their commitment to protect us, commitment to our country. They're very bright, very able. They also were, I should say this, very, very adroit. Every bureaucracy in Washington And the Pentagon is a bureaucracy as well. You know that. You've worked there. Every bureaucracy in Washington has some level of proficiency at spinning their story and trying to maneuver the president to do what they want to do. No agency is better than that, than the Pentagon. And there are different ways. Sometimes it's selective leaks. Sometimes it's sending someone up to the Hill to testify and getting friendly questions from friendly members of Congress who want to elicit a certain reply that they know will create pressures on the president. We saw this during the Afghanistan review. And, how much of it was, I think if you listen to Secretary Gates, a lot of it was, people within the bureaucracy not authorized from the top. But nonetheless, General McChrystal was asked to write a review and make recommendations. We read those recommendations in the Washington Post, I think, before the president saw them. Bob Woodward had the memo before the president. So, they're very good at that. So I think they're proficient in they do a tremendous job. I was so impressed by the level of thought and competence, as well as the commitment to the country that I saw. And I was impressed as I should add the story. General Petraeus is coming today for any of you who are interested. When he, in Bob Woodward's book, he referred to me as the ultimate spinmeister. And I was on a Sunday show the week the book came out. Christiana Amanpour was the host. She read this quote to me. And I said, well, I've seen General Petraeus on television, and I have to assume that he meant that admiringly, as a compliment. And a few days later, I got a message from Petraeus via the NSC, and it just said, I think you handled that perfectly. So, but I think that Petraeus is a good example. It's always been true. We saw General MacArthur. He lost his battle with President Truman, but it's always been true that there is a political nature to the military job. It's not just about defense and war, but also they are a political organism as well.
It might not be partisan, but they're a political player.
Oh, I don't think it's partisan. Oh, I wouldn't say that at all. No, I think that if they have a consensus view about what should be done, they're going to use every tool available to try and produce that outcome.
So you've talked about this idea that during the Afghanistan strategy review, the president was a little bit jammed or boxed in by the leak of the McChrystal report recommending more troops. We've talked to leaders who say and Secretary Gates wrote in his memoir also that was absolutely not intentional, not coordinated.
Right.
It accidentally looked that way.
Yeah. No, I understand. No. It was, someone didn't leave the McChrystal report on a bus, and Bob Woodward came along and found it. Someone, it may not have been at that level, it may have been at a lower level, but someone leaked it. Admiral Mullen went to the Hill and testified, about the McChrystal report in a way that definitely put a spin on the ball. There were a series of things that happened. It wasn't just the leaking of the report. And I think they felt a sense of urgency. I understand they felt a sense of urgency. I think President Obama held, 9 sessions on the Afghanistan policy because he wanted to get it right and he wanted to explore all the avenues. For military guys who are eager to go, I think the process was, in their view, too laborious. So I understand everything that was going on, and it's fine. I appreciate everybody. Everybody glosses their stories for their particular memoirs. I understand that. I might be accused of that myself. But the reality was there were pressures being put on the president, and I think that we worked through that.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
Another point of civil-military tension during that time frame, maybe even the culmination of it, was in June of 2010, the firing of General McChrystal from his post as the commander of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, which people generally understand as the result of this Rolling Stone profile that came out that attributed some disrespectful comments about senior administration officials to him and his team. But from your standpoint, do you believe the president's decision to relieve General McChrystal was just about that article, or was it more of like a broad reassertion of...
I really think it was about that article. The article was not... It was a little less benign than you. I mean, General McChrystal, and I had a chance to talk to him about it when he was here. General McChrystal and his staff were in Paris, and they made the mistake of allowing a reporter, now deceased, Michael Hastings, to encamp with them. And they blew off a lot of steam in their frustration. They were eager to go, and they wanted this surge in Afghanistan, and they were angry that it hadn't happened and frustrated. They were particularly angry at Vice President Biden, and he was a particular focus of their attack. But they were fundamentally disrespectful in their quotes. And the real question was, in terms of chain of command and military-civilian relationships, could that go unresponded to? And the president thought long and hard about it. I can tell you with absolute certainty, the president was not eager for Stan McChrystal to go, not eager for him to go. And the day that he came in and was relieved of his command, the president called us together in the Oval Office, his staff, and said, I do not want anyone here to suggest to anyone on the record or off the record that this is a good day. This is not a good day. A good man just left here, quite possibly his career over, and that is not a good day. And let me just add, one of his big concerns was, given the frayed relationships with President Karzai and the place at which we were in the war, that how are we going to, how would a new leader, commander there, relate to the situation? And ultimately the solution was to ask General Petraeus, who had a relationship with Karzai, who understood the whole situation and had broad respect, to ask him to come and take over in Afghanistan, and that is what ultimately happened.
So when we spoke to General McChrystal, he said the initial reason for inviting the Rolling Stone reporter to join his team was he felt there wasn't enough being done to drive up public support for the war. There wasn't enough being done to sell the war to the American people. Do you feel there was enough being done? Do you feel like your team was doing enough messaging about the war?
Well, it's kind of ironic because the accusation I hear sometimes is that we were too political and concerned about public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so for General McChrystal to say, gee, they weren't political enough and working hard enough on public opinion, I find hard to process.
Mm-hmm.
And if, in fact, his goal was to sell the war, and look, I have really high regard for Stan McChrystal. I mean, he is an extraordinary guy. And again, my absolute conviction is that he wanted to do the best job he possibly could to stabilize Afghanistan, to give them a chance for civil society, and all the things that we wanted. But if his goal was to sell the war, that was an awfully clumsy way to do it. And it may speak to the fact that you should leave politics and public relations to the politics and public relations people, because that would be a textbook example of bad strategy right there.
I think that what a lot of critics, and maybe what General McChrystal was getting at, they kind of believe that you helped lead one of the most effective messaging and communications teams in political history. And you had, the bully pulpit of one of the greatest orators ever to be the president, right? Do you think that you would have done anything more or differently after they had decided on